April 12, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The humid air clung to everything, to uniforms, to the metal skin of the aircraft, even to the tension in the pilots' voices. Down the muddy runway, a dark blue fighter with oddly bent wings idled, its massive propeller kicking up a hurricane of dust. Mechanics shouted over the roar, goggles fogged, hands slick with sweat and oil. Marine Lieutenant John Jack Smith checked his harness for the 5th time, staring at the strange gull-winged machine that sat before him like some monstrous bird. The Nouveau F4U Corsair. Pilots called it the Ensign Eliminator. It was powerful, yes, but landing it had already killed more than a few men. He muttered to his crew chief, "You sure about those flaps?" The mechanic smirked nervously. "Sure as I'll ever be, sir. She's got a mean bite, though." Jack climbed into the cockpit, the smell of fuel thick and sweet. The cockpit canopy slid shut with a metallic click, sealing him inside a world of dials, switches, and vibration. When he throttled forward, the entire machine seemed to growl, 2,000 horsepower of Pratt and Whitney muscle straining for release. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots had already heard rumors about America's new fighter. They laughed when they saw the photos, the awkward gull wings, the enormous engine that looked more like a flying barrel. To them, it was a clumsy brute, no match for the sleek, agile Mitsubishi Zero. As the Corsair roared down the runway, it leapt into the air like a fist through smoke. The wings flexed under the strain, and the sound, that distinctive rising whistle from air rushing through its engine vents, echoed across the field. The mechanics looked up. "Whistling Death," one of them muttered. The name would stick. High above the jungle canopy, the Corsair climbed like nothing before it, a blur of blue steel cutting through the tropical haze. Jack could feel the torque tugging at the stick, the vibrations of raw, barely controlled power. But the real test was still ahead. Out over the Solomon Sea, radar picked up dots on the horizon, Japanese fighters closing fast. The Zeros. Radio chatter snapped to life. "Eyes up, Corsairs, incoming bandits, 11 o'clock high." Jack's hand tightened on the throttle. The F4U was fast, but she was unproven. The Navy didn't even trust her on carriers yet. This was her trial by fire. Through the canopy, sunlight glinted off silver wings, Zeros diving in perfect formation. The Japanese pilots believed they were about to tear apart another clumsy American experiment. But this time, they were wrong. Jack rolled the Corsair onto its side, the gull wings slicing the sky, and dove straight into the enemy formation. The engine howled, the guns flashed, and within seconds, one Zero spiraled downward in flames. The others scattered in surprise. The heavy, awkward Corsair had just outdove and outgunned them. Over the next 10 minutes, the sky became a twisting ballet of fire and smoke. The Corsair was fast, terrifyingly fast, and its dive speed outmatched anything the Japanese had ever faced. By the time Jack returned to Henderson Field, low on fuel and adrenaline still pounding in his chest, for enemy aircraft were gone. The ground crew cheered as he climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were trembling, his flight suit soaked with sweat. "How'd she fly, sir?" someone asked. Jack grinned, like a devil with wings. The laughter and mockery from the other side of the Pacific would soon turn into silence, then fear. The Corsair had arrived, and it was hungry. By mid-1943, the Pacific skies belonged to no one. Battles raged daily, over atolls, convoys, and tiny specks of jungle airstrips. The Japanese Zero still ruled the dogfights of the early war, its lightweight frame twisting and dancing with deadly precision. But now, the Corsair had joined the fight, and the balance was shifting with every sortie. At the Marine base on Vella La Vella, the humid air carried a constant background of sound, the rattle of .50 caliber guns, the grinding whine of engines, and somewhere distant, the whistle that gave the Corsair its fearsome nickname. Japanese radio operators soon began reporting it in their transmissions. "The Whistling Death has returned." In the ready tent, pilots wiped sweat from their foreheads as the briefing officer spoke. "We've confirmed it. The Japs have spotted the new birds. They're calling them Whistling Demons. They think it's a dive bomber." That drew a few laughs. But for men like Jack Smith, who'd already seen what the Corsair could do, there was nothing funny about it. Outside, mechanics fueled up the bent-wing fighters, their dark blue paint reflecting the sunrise. They were monsters of torque and steel, fast, unforgiving, and powerful beyond measure. To fly a Corsair well was to ride the edge between control and chaos. When the squadron took off that morning, they were climbing into enemy airspace north of Bougainville. The Japanese had been raiding Allied positions for weeks, and today would be no exception. As the Corsairs reached 20,000 feet, Jack's squadron leader, Captain Red Dawson, spoke calmly over the radio. "Eyes peeled. Sun at your back. Make M chase you. That's when she shines." Moments later, the radio crackled again. Zeros, 2 o'clock high, closing fast. The dogfight exploded out of nowhere. Silver streaks against the blue, tracer fire slicing the sky. Jack yanked the stick, pulling into a steep climb. The Corsair's massive engine roared like thunder. A Zero latched onto his tail, its 20mm cannons flashing. Jack rolled hard left, dropped the nose, and dove. The Corsair screamed through the clouds, air tearing across the gull wings. The whistle rose to a shriek, a sound that made Japanese pilots flinch even before they saw the tracers. At 400 knots, Jack pulled the trigger. 6.50 caliber guns unleashed a storm of lead, shredding the Zero in an instant. The Japanese pilot never saw it coming. Down below, Red Dawson's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep moving. Don't dogfight M, outrun M." That was the Corsair's secret. It could dive faster, climb higher, and survive hits that would tear a Zero in half. Its armor absorbed punishment. Its speed made escape possible when the odds turned. When the squadron returned to base that afternoon, every Corsair was pockmarked with bullet holes, but every man came home. 7 Japanese aircraft hadn't. As the sun sank behind the palms, the mechanics counted the kill marks being painted onto the blue fuselages. The numbers grew each week. At first, the Navy had doubted the Corsair. Too heavy for carriers, too dangerous to land. But the Marines, desperate for an edge in the Pacific, had taken it, tamed it, and turned it into a legend. By late 1943, the Whistling Death was doing what the skeptics said was impossible, winning air superiority from the Zero itself. And over the Japanese radio, one chilling phrase kept repeating, "Beware the Blue Devil." January 1944. Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. The airfield shimmered under the tropical sun. Rows of Corsairs lined up like sleeping beasts, their wings folded, noses pointed skyward. The once feared Ensign Eliminator had begun to earn a new reputation, the Marines' best friend in the sky. But getting there hadn't been easy. The F4U was still a brute to handle. Young pilots crashed on landings, bounced off carrier decks, or stalled on final approach. Its massive engine blocked the runway from view, and one mistake meant a fiery end. Captain Red Dawson stood beside his Corsair, cigarette in hand, watching a rookie Marine come in too high. The aircraft wobbled, dropped suddenly. The landing gear smashed into the ground, sparks flying. The propeller bent. Fuel spilled across the tarmac. Red exhaled smoke and muttered, "She doesn't forgive amateurs." The Navy had refused to deploy it from carriers for that very reason. Instead, the Marines took her to island bases, rough strips carved from coral and jungle, and learned her temperament the hard way. Jack Smith remembered those first weeks well. The Corsair demanded precision, strength, and patience. Push the throttle too early, and it rolled over. Come in too slow, and it dropped like a rock. But once mastered, nothing in the sky could touch it. Pilots began sharing tricks in the mess tent. How to crab into a landing, how to use the engine's torque to tighten turns, how to keep her steady in a dive. The Corsair was more than a plane. It was a living, breathing challenge. One evening, as rain drummed on the tin roof, Jack listened as Red Dawson told a newcomer, "If you respect her, she'll respect you. But if you think you can muscle her around like a wildcat, she'll kill you before the enemy does." It wasn't bravado. It was gospel. By spring, the Marines had turned the Corsair from an engineering problem into a precision weapon. Dogfighting reports began pouring in. Kill ratios so high they seemed impossible. 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost. The Zero, once untouchable, was suddenly prey. The reason was simple: technology and adaptation. The Corsair's speed, at over 400 miles per hour, shattered the limits of Japanese fighters. Its armor and firepower gave pilots confidence to engage and survive. And its dive speed, unmatched, allowed pilots to strike from above and vanish before the enemy could react. One Japanese survivor later wrote, "We thought they were madmen. They came from the sun, screaming like demons. By the time we turned, they were gone." The Pacific skies had changed forever. On a dusty airstrip one late afternoon, Jack stood beside his Corsair as mechanics patched bullet holes in the fuselage. A group of new pilots gathered nearby, staring at the aircraft's iconic bent wings. One of them whispered, "Why'd they make it look like that?" Jack smiled. "They laughed at those wings once, too." He climbed into the cockpit, pulled down the canopy, and the engine thundered to life, the familiar rising whistle echoing across the palm trees. That sound, once mocked, had become the most feared noise in the Pacific. Summer 1944. The Solomon Islands. The Pacific War had entered a new phase. Island by island, the Allies were clawing their way toward Japan. Every beachhead was a furnace of fire and chaos. Every strip of coral another foothold bought with blood. Above it all, the Corsairs ruled the air. From dawn until dusk, the whistling death prowled the skies, strafing enemy convoys, bombing jungle positions, and dueling with the last remnants of Japan's once dominant fighter wings. The Marines no longer looked up in fear when the sun flashed off distant wings. If it was blue and bent, it was one of theirs. At the forward airstrip on Bougainville, Lieutenant Jack Smith leaned against the wing of his Corsair, drinking lukewarm coffee as the ground shook from naval bombardment in the distance. He was leaner now, hardened by 2 years of combat. The laughter of the early days was gone. The stakes had changed. This was no longer about proving an airplane worked. It was about survival and victory. The briefing officer entered the tent, pointing at a map of the Truk Lagoon. "Intelligence confirms heavy Japanese air presence around the fleet anchorage. You'll fly top cover for the Avengers during the strike. Expect resistance, plenty of zeros." Jack nodded, glancing around at the faces of his squadron. They weren't rookies anymore. Each man had stories etched into his expression, near misses, lost friends, the weight of endless missions. Hours later, the Corsairs thundered into the blue, engines rumbling in perfect rhythm. The sun glared off the ocean below, where U.S. ships formed a line of steel specks. Ahead, the volcanic peaks of Truk rose from the mist, and beyond them, the enemy. As the first bombs fell, the sky erupted in motion. Dozens of Zeros clawed their way upward to intercept. The once invincible hunters now found themselves outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered. Jack's voice crackled over the radio. "Eyes on bogies, 11 o'clock high. Break right." The formation scattered. The Corsairs dove headlong into the melee, .50 caliber guns blazing. Japanese tracers sliced through the air, but the blue fighters held the advantage: speed, armor, firepower. A Zero locked onto Red Dawson's tail. Jack rolled, dropped in behind, and unleashed a burst. The enemy exploded into fragments, black smoke curling downward into the ocean. "Nice shooting, Jack," Red shouted, pulling up. "Let's finish it." In less than 10 minutes, the Japanese defense collapsed. The airfield below burned, and the once feared Zero was now a symbol of desperation. The Corsairs circled above, their engines howling triumphantly as they returned to escort the bombers home. By the time they landed, the horizon behind them glowed orange, another Japanese stronghold reduced to silence. The ground crews cheered as the fighters taxied in, oil-streaked and battle-scarred. One mechanic leaned over to another. "You ever notice that whistle when they come back?" The man grinned. "Yeah, sounds like victory." For Japan's pilots, it had become the sound of dread. The Corsair was no longer mocked. It was respected, feared, worshipped by some, cursed by others. By war's end, its kill ratio against Japanese aircraft exceeded 11-1, a staggering number that spoke to both engineering brilliance and human determination. Years later, veterans would still talk about that sound, the rising whistle, the thunder of the engine, the power that seemed to pull the very air apart. It wasn't just a fighter plane. It was a message. That mockery means nothing when mastery takes flight.